Hi, this is Paul. We're going to get back into the abolition of man and a little bit of review over my last video from Alister McGrath. But I want to begin again where Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris began in the Vancouver talks, because
So the first thing is, I think that partly what's driving you, if this is accurate, is that you want to ground a structure of ethics in something solid. And there's two things you want to avoid, two catastrophes, let's say. One is the catastrophe that you identified with religious fundamentalism, and the other is the catastrophe that's associated with moral relativism. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Okay, well, no, but it's...
Okay, and so again, just at the outset, Peterson and Harris and Weinstein are all aspiring to moral objectivity, objective moral values. They are not relativists, and we'll hear this later, because Harris will say Auschwitz was wrong, the Gulag was wrong. This is not a relativist position. Now, there we go. In my last video with Alister McGrath, Alister McGrath actually makes kind of a nice segue into this, and I'm going to use a bunch of the stills that Alister McGrath had in his presentation in that video. Talked about Alex Rosenberg, and Alex Rosenberg is about embracing nihilism, or what I would say the can. And this is what we're able. There's some ties to Nietzsche here, perhaps. Alex Rosenberg, is there a God? No. And these are his answers. Okay, he's very brief and to the point about them. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the nature of the universe? There is none. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. So Rosenberg is not on the same page as Harris or Weinstein or Peterson or Douglas Murray, for that matter. A couple more Rosenberg quotes from his book. Science provides all the sufficient truths about reality, and knowing such truths is what real understanding is about. That's a definition of understanding. And you listen to Note in the Network, he does a lot of good work on understanding, and he's been reading Cardinal Ratzinger, Introduction to Christianity, and a number of people have recommended that book to me, and I'm thinking of picking it up and starting to work on it, because some of the stuff that Note has been putting out with respect to Ratzinger's book sounds like it's very much barking up the same tree, which one of the watchers of my videos, you know who you are, you've asked questions at a variety of Peterson events pretty early on. I mean, you kept pushing Ratzinger, and we tend to pick up books that eventually we see the purpose for. But there's a lot built into Alex Rosenberg's definition here that he just kind of asserts. He doesn't defend. Science provides all the significant truths about reality. Knowing such truths is what real understanding is about. And again, this is an assertion. Being scientistic just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both to our nature and everything else's. And so it's interesting when you listen to Rosenberg. On one hand, in terms of the celebrity atheists, that would be Dillahunty and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and we can even throw Woodford Rationality Rules into that mix. They're all in this, they're all in there. But now Rosenberg says, give up the purpose business. It's just not there. What is scientism? A totalizing attitude that regards science as the ultimate standard and arbiter of all interesting questions, or alternatively that seeks to expand. Now, interesting is such an interesting word in terms of how it pops up in these debates, and you can get into this entire a priori system, and that which directs our interest. That's part of this a priori system that Peterson is working on. Or alternatively, that seeks to expand the very definition and scope of science to encompass all aspects of human knowledge and understanding. That's what scientism is. Now, Alex Rosenberg, says we have to be nihilists. Now, again, it's if you're a true nihilist, can you establish an ought? Because I think one nihilist to another would say, shrug. If there is no purpose, why ought we to assert there is no purpose? If there is no purpose, it's absolute freedom. Then we're in a sense back to Nietzsche, and it's only can, and can becomes in a sense must, but must only lives beneath can. Okay, we have to be nihilists about the purpose of things in general. And again, every time I read a sentence like that, I chuckle, because why would a nihilist say such a thing like this? He's got no ground upon which to make the must assertion, to give the ought. We have to be nihilists about the things in general, about the purpose of biological life in particular, and the purpose of life in general. There is no purpose, and this is where I get into my little rectangle here, where you have reason from above, experience or empiricism from below. You have some knowledge of the past, its history, its record, but there can be no future. And so the future is completely open. There is no ought about the future. You only have the indicative. Okay, and when we get into Lewis, we're going to talk about the indicative and the imperative. But all there is the indicative. That's all there can be. That's what scientism will say. Every time a scientific person uses the word have to or ought or must or should, they are violating their own system. They are simply being hypocrites, because where is the should of nihilism? Ultimately, science and scientism are going to make us give up illusory. Why would it make us give it up? Because again, if there is no purpose, then any purpose, it is as good as the next, are going to make us give up as illusory the very thing conscious experience screams out at us loudest and longest. The notion that when we think, our thoughts are about anything at all, inside or outside our minds. The elephant on the rider is a purely chattering creature and has very little to say or do about anything. We're just rather disconnected creatures yammering about things, which makes his prophecy here all that more difficult to imagine could happen. So there's actually an atheist moral menu here. Alex Rosenberg, there is no good, only can, and science affords you power, and science and technology afford you power. But don't ask what you is, just keep doing what you want. And that's some of the difficulties. It's obvious to look at the difficulties of faith. For many of you, those difficulties are evident, but the difficulties of this position may not be so evident to you, because in a sense, at some point, you just have to say, so what? Now, Iris Murdoch, who Alister McGrath turns to next, says, no, there has to be a transcendent good, or none of this stuff that we've built will finally make any sense. One of the main problems of moral philosophy might be formulated thus: are there any techniques for the purification and reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish? Okay, now we're going to get into this quite a bit, because this is the question of the selfish gene or the assassin robot. And is there any way to purify? Is there any way to reform? Can we improve? Because finally, if you look at the celebrity atheists, their goal is the reformation of humanity, just like Gaius and Titius wanted to reform those students that they were supposed to be teaching English to in the abolition of man. So techniques for the purification or reorientation of an energy which is naturally selfish, in such a way that when moments of choice arise, so there's a you here and there's choice here, we shall be sure to act rightly. So in other words, well, what is rightly? Rightly would be that which conforms to reality. And that's when you listen to Dillahunty and Sam Harris and Rationality Rules. This is exactly what they are saying, that we ought to conform to reality. And what that means is that there is a moral order out there. There is objective value. You can be better or worse. If you have 2 + 2, 5 is a better answer than 6. It's closer. 4 is the best answer, but and you have a duty to align yourself with this reality. And in fact, that assertion is beneath, in fact, even the pursuit of science. And it's beneath the pursuit of, well, we're going to get into some of the logical inconsistencies beneath our culture, because on one hand we say we should be truth seeking, on the other hand we say we should be eliminating suffering. Well, part of what's difficult for us as human beings is that when there are truths we don't want to face, we avoid them in the name of avoiding suffering. And so this truth seeking and this goal of avoiding suffering are, they're not so easily wed. Iris Murdoch continues, on the term good, the proper seriousness of the term refers us to a perfection which is perhaps never exemplified in the world we know. There is no good in us. This is from the Book of Common Prayer. And some of you might look at this and say, boy, that sounds a lot like Calvinism. There is no good in us. Well, what do we mean by that? It means that, again, the Calvinist doctrine of total depravity. Total depravity does not mean we are all as bad as we could be. What it does mean is that we have dirty hands, and that we have our eyes distort. We are motivated, as Adam says over in Think Club, we are motivated reasoners. There are biases within us that warp and skew our ability to interact with the world of truth around us, and we are determined, motivated reasoners. We are filled with biases because there are reasons for this. Now, the good, that which is unassailable by this, we don't get there. The proper seriousness of the term refers us to a perfection which is perhaps never exemplified in the world we know. There is no good in us, and which carries with it the idea of transcendence. So there is a transcendent good, but we struggle with it. Good is a transcendent reality, means that virtue is an attempt to pierce the veil of selfish consciousness and join the world as it really is. And this is beneath the project of truth. And the celebrity atheists purport to be all about that project. And in fact, in the name of the search for truth, that's how they conduct their crusade against religion, because religion is untruth, and they'd like to critique religion in the name of truth, in the name of good. And that's in fact where they derive their imagined moral high ground against all comers. It is an empirical fact about human nature that this attempt cannot be entirely successful. Now, I don't know if Sam Harris believes that, but Rupert Murdoch has passed, so he can't talk to her, but he might benefit from her books. Well, what is this good made of? And this is, again, a real problem for materialists. Now, Daniel Dennett wants to say information. That's really weak sauce. I mean, in information, but information, you have exactly the same problem as you have with the monarchical vision. Once you interact with information, our motivated reason, that which selects what is interesting, takes the stuff out in the world, and even before our conscious self engages with it, sets it up in a hierarchy. And this, again, is where psychology comes into play, because this is what we do, and there are many ways to show that this is what we do. Bertrand Russell says, whatever knowledge is attainable must be attainable by scientific methods. And what science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. And I think if Bertrand Russell were still around, Peterson would have a hard time with this, because there's whole ranges of knowledge that we work on and require and employ in pragmatic ways that we don't know scientifically. Again, you'll hear Peterson say again and again, scientific thinking is hard. But what is this good made of? Where is it from? Can it be known? How? You can use must if there is no, can you use must if there is no transcendent good? So Bertrand Russell's statements here, in whatever knowledge is attainable must be attained by scientific method. Okay, that's an assertion. Can you back up that assertion by scientific method? If you can't, then your whole statement falls apart. And then Alister McGrath brings in Richard Rorty. There is nothing deep down inside us except what we have put there ourselves. No criterion that we have not created in the course of creating a practice, no standard of rationality that is not an appeal to such a criterion, no rigorous argumentation that is not obedient to our own conventions. Now, I think Rorty, as a pragmatist, gets a little closer to Peterson here, and he's very much living within the secular box, and probably what Peterson would illuminate is when he says, we, no criterion that we have not created in the course of creating a practice. Peterson would back that sucker up all the way 3.5 million years and say, that's who we is. It's we, including our ape, our primate ancestors, our mammalian ancestors, our reptilian ancestors, all the way back to the lobster and even before. Where once this is how the a priori structure gets created, and this then creates our sense of the good, and this gets passed on. It gets built into our bodies in terms of hardware, and it gets built into our societies, that which is encoded in us by other human beings as software, and it gets built into our cultures, and it gets built into our customs, and it gets built into our laws. And Peterson, Rorty probably wouldn't say this, but Peterson would say, well, these are the gods. But Rorty himself acknowledges that, well, there's a problem with this. When the secret police come, when the torturers violate the innocent, there is nothing to be said to them of the form, there is something within you which you are betraying. Though you embody the practice of a totalitarian system which will endure forever, there is something beyond those practices which condemns you. And I think this is where Peterson would critique him, because I think Peterson would assert that, in fact, there is pragmatic goodness built into us that could critique the totalitarian system, and would basically say totalitarian systems fail the standard of Darwinian truth because they don't promote survival of the species and imagine progress of the species. But that same definition of Darwinian purpose and Darwinian truth has a weakness when it comes to the question of, well, survival of which species? Now, if we, again, are the bootloaders for our AI progeny, well, then all of this serves the AI progeny. But what if that proves to be a dead end? And part of the problem about the Darwinian universe is that there is always a dead end, and that dead end is the heat death of the universe. And then we have the other problem of we, which is, do I myself participate in the we? And you have all those people who have lived under totalitarian governments. I'm working on Daniel 3 right now, and Daniel 3 is basically Nebuchadnezzar setting up which was pretty much common in the ancient world, a religiously totalitarian government in Babylon. That's how most humans have functioned. And so Peterson, in a sense, is like this clip we're going to see of Dillahunty later, where Peterson, when he says, well, our Western form of government is the best, in a sense, he's kind of driving with the same metrics that Dillahunty and Harris are, in that, how do you know it's the best? Against what standard do you say it's the best? Well, it seems to be, well, it seems to be what? Well, Scott Alexander might say, well, it seems to be stronger than other cultures in the world. Okay. But what if this particular culture of consumerism and of personal self-expression, in fact, leads to another dead end, not unlike Neanderthals or some other Darwinian dead end. You can't know right now what the end will be because, again, within a Darwinian system, just like within all of these other secular systems, well, you can't know the end of the story, or I should say it this way, the story doesn't have a happy ending because you'll have the death of the sun. Well, maybe we've expanded out into the universe. Okay, but then you have the death of the universe. The problem is this story always ends in death. And when you have that kind of story, you have the question of nihilism. Richard Dawkins, Alister McGrath has done a fair bit of work on Richard Dawkins stuff. We have the power to defy the selfish genes of our birth, and if necessary, the selfish memes of our indoctrination. We are built as gene machines and cultured as gene machines, but we have the power to turn against our creators. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. And again, you'd have to ask why. Now, you might appeal to Harari and say that we have transcended the genetic verse with the story verse. And so if you read Harari's book Sapiens, you'll hear him talk about, and I think quite rightly, that one of the things that human beings were able to do is to adapt and change ourselves via stories, because genes just simply change too slowly. And when you look at the amazing, again, what's my standard for calling it amazing? It might in fact be suicidal, but the amazing progress of humanity over the last 10,000 years and the speed of change, which seems to be accelerating, well, Harari would say that's because change in the story verse is faster than change in the genetic verse. And I think that's right. And so when you have Peterson talking to Harris, Peterson keeps going to story. Peterson is onto something there, because it is in fact via story that we remake ourselves so dramatically and so quickly. And this has led to the ability of humanity to colonize the natural world in ways that no other creature in the world is even close to doing. Now Dawkins, that's where Dawkins' memes get interesting, because in a sense, the memes are the story verse versus the genetic verse. And if we're looking for a way in which, I'm about to play some Bret Weinstein from Rebel Wisdom, if you look at how this works, Bret hasn't said it this way, but you could argue with Bret that in fact the way that we transcend the gene verse is with story. Now, this is a big problem if you're a materialist, because again, the status of story in a material universe is a bit difficult if you're a celebrity atheist, because basically what you have to say is that what civilization has done via story is colonize the material and change it utterly. In other words, story is higher than matter in terms of its power, or this materialistic correspondence orientation of truth. Well, I want to play two clips from one video from Rebel Wisdom, which is a really excellent video. It doesn't have as many views as it deserves, actually. And so let's listen to Bret Weinstein describe our problem.
The other thing, and you point to it, I think you called it the psychonaut route into that sort of unity, involves an enlightenment, an awakening to a deep truth. And the analogy I use is this: if you discovered that you were a robot and that you were sent to, assassinate some person who was innocent, if you discovered that that was the explanation for you, you would reject your program, right? You, as robot that had been given decency in order to get by everybody so you could commit your assassination would say, actually, I prioritize the values and I reject the mission that I've been sent on.
So there's Peterson's hierarchy of values. And the question is, why would this robot do this? How would this robot do this? Let's use Dennett's term. From where would this robot get other information that would place higher in the hierarchy of values in order to say that there is an ought? And again, I don't think we're going to get the ought in anything but the Storyverse. And what he's saying here is that you can't find the ought in the genes. And Harari says the same thing. That you get an ought from the Storyverse that makes me want to transcend my assassin robot programming.
That's who we are. We are that robot. We are on a genetic mission that is absolutely unacceptable.
How would you just succinctly define that genetic mission?
That genetic mission is
Just propagation at all costs?
propagation of your particular genetic spellings. And here's the key. It's a little subtle, but if you and I have different spellings for a particular, let's say, a respiratory enzyme, and let's say that respiratory enzyme functions better in you than in me. It's 10% more efficient. My respiratory enzyme still wants your respiratory enzyme to go extinct because it doesn't care about the function.
And it's amazing how we translate what all of them would assert are unconscious, impersonal forces into the Storyverse by this translation.
It cares that that spelling is advanced. And
we can't appropriate genetic information without translating it into story. Why? Well, because we are stories.
Spelling is in conflict with my spelling. As long as yours is around, there will be fewer copies of mine. So our genomes are actually interested. If I can just be clear about it, the mindfuck of the whole thing is that the entire evolutionary story is the cosmic spelling bee and it ends in genocide, right? Once you realize that that's what you are, that you're built to advance your genetic spellings into the future generations, irrespective of what they spell, and that under circumstances like these, we can afford to be decent to each other, but if things were different, one of us would be putting the other in a gas chamber. No way. I want no part of that, and neither do you. So when people realize that that's really what they are built to be nice when it makes sense to be nice, and they're built to be genocidal in circumstances when genocide is the thing, then the question is, well, all of the things that you actually value, how consistent are they with being that robot on that mission?
So
Now, what's fascinating to me here is what he's basically saying is that, well, when come to a point where your story verse is in conflict with your genetic verse, there are points when you ought to deny the genetic verse. And what does that mean? It means dying. It means allowing yourself to be killed, because there are points when there's kill or be killed. Well, what does the assassin robot DNA tell us to do? And it says to kill. And, well, you just deny this. Okay. What that means, if you deny it, is that you die. Now, again, if you keep telling this story, it begins to sound like a story in the most published book in all of human history, where someone says he knows the truth, and he says everyone else is confused, and they don't know what they're doing, and those are the words he speaks as the assassin robots are working out their programming.
it sounds like you are sort of saying, at our root, we are nasty, brutish, and short, right? The old selfish gene kind of thing, compared to some ascensionist or triumphalist. Clearly, it's very prevalent in the self-help, popular psychology space. We are on the frothy edge of realizing our true natures as, spiritual beings, blah, blah, blah. Is that something you don't hold out hope for? You feel like at root, we are just self-oriented robot programs? What's our shot at redemption? Do we have one?
It's easier. It's easier than you would think, because the fact is, I'm telling you, we are that robot on that mission. Once you know that that's your mission, you could just reject it. right? I'm not putting anybody in a gas chamber. I just won't do it, right? I don't care about the genetic spellings at all, and I really don't. If I
But again, you have to ask, what is I in this? He's a story. That's how he understands himself. Now, it's interesting to listen to this and think about what happened at Evergreen. I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not going to think any less of him for the choices he made at Evergreen. In fact, he was, I think, more noble, more brave, and more heroic than most of the other people there, which is in fact why we know about him. But again, this is all in the Storyverse.
Discovered that my sons were switched in the hospital at birth and they were not actually related to me, it doesn't change my relationship to them. It doesn't affect whether I love them. I don't love them because of their genetic spellings. So my point is, we are actually, evolution screwed up. It handed us the tools to recognize that we don't have to value the game that it is playing and that we can now repurpose the hardware to something that's actually worthwhile. And how liberating is that? I mean, who wants to walk around with bigotry?
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about this video is that listen to what he says right before this segment of the conversation.
Unite.
I would just add that one thing you can do once you realize that that pattern is there is recognize that where this ends is not good unless we intervene. So, in other words, this pattern of there's abundance leads to certain kinds of willingness to interact, broad-mindedness, let's say. Then there's contraction and austerity, and that results in a kind of tribalism. This oscillation is going to kill us. Mm-hmm. The solution to it involves architecting a stable, a steady state that gives us the inputs of abundance in a way that does not oscillate between boom and bust.
Okay, so what he has right here is he sees the problem. He says, well, the problem with humanity is we have this, you can watch this in his other videos, you have this oscillation between boom and bust, and we get very liberal in terms of generous when we've got plenty to eat, when we're living relatively secure lives. And this is why you find liberalism in the prosperous West, because suddenly, yeah, let the Syrians come in, let the Mexicans come in, let's have abundant, a rigorous social safety network and tax us at high percentages so that the government can provide these things. I'm obviously playing with different definitions of liberal here, so don't hear this too politically, but when times are fat, we're generous. In lean times, when times are scarce, well, then we get tribal. Then it's me and mine. Then I'm looking out for my family. And you watch a show like The Walking Dead, it's basically a study in it. And so this is what's going on. And he says, well, we have this oscillation. So he said, okay, there's your picture of the world. Now what we have to do is, and then he gives a solution. Well, we have to rejigger ourselves so that you're actually, if you hit lean times, you don't become those assassin robots. Okay. But doesn't that mean you'll die? And if you look at, for example, Nietzsche's beggar religion, which he calls Christianity, well, the story of Christianity is, of course, at the center of it is a man who is unjustly accused and who, even given the power that within the story he could easily have gotten out. In fact, he could have easily gotten out of his execution without the power. Pilate's practically begging to let him off, to give him an excuse, and he won't take it. And so he's not going to do what all of his followers want him to do, which is to kill their enemies. And so, well, okay, this is the plan. Bret's got his vision. This is how we can, now that we have nuclear weapons and all of this enormous technological power, this is how we can avoid killing ourselves. But there's a problem.
If you can create...
So what does that even look like?
It looks like a world in which people have enough, they have the sense that things are getting better because you've architected them to give people that sense of
they have enough, not necessarily what they want, but they have enough, and you architect them that they have a sense that they do have enough and that they're secure. So if you make them feel that they're secure, well, what's funny about this is, well, isn't this the trick that dictators pull? It's one of the tricks. The other trick, of course, there's the terrible enemy over there, and you marshal the people, or you just, well, it's bred in circuses, right? I mean, the Roman emperors knew how to do this. Well, half of you are slaves, and we've just killed millions in Gaul, and we've enslaved another million in Gaul. But look at the show. That's how you do it. This isn't necessarily a new program.
Bret. In other words, maybe you have shifted growth into a different mode. In other words, if everybody is freed to be generative, so you're constantly encountering new, interesting stuff, that feels like the world of abundance that happens when you've just discovered some concentrated source of growth.
It's fundamentally entertainment. It's the circuses. It's the Colosseum. It's Netflix. It's the internet. It's YouTube.
It may not be predicated on growth, and that's the point, is we're not in a position as human beings to track actual growth. So if we can substitute things that feel like growth, then we will put people into their growth mindset, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Maybe let's put everybody in VR. And even though the world is a disaster out there, everything feels good. Or maybe we're all sucked into a giant machine with all these tubes in our back and being used as batteries. But make them think that there's meaning and purpose. Because actually, what you really do need more than just comfort is also meaning. Because I think Peterson is right that meaning's at the top of the hierarchy.
And then they can afford, and they will naturally be inclined to be decent to each other.
What you're describing seems, beautiful, possible, but wildly ambitious, and would take a hell of a long time if it worked at all. I mean, are you talking about like a fundamental retooling of socioeconomic structures and national stories and pervasive messaging and public sentiment? Or to the point where people are like, oh yes, we can afford to be generous, we can afford to be kind, we can afford to be inclusive?
I'm talking about a process that will take 3 generations at least.
Okay, do we have that much time?
Well, let's put it this way. You don't need to solve the entire problem at once. You need to forestall the existential threats. None of them can come to fruition if this project is to work. So we have to wake up to those things that threaten us acutely, and we have
And who's to determine what's threatening us acutely?
to begin addressing them. That does not have to happen in exactly the same moment as people begin to feel a steady state abundance. But you do have to give them a burst of abundance in order to relax the tribalism that is setting in.
So the question is, how do we get enough people to have a post-global experience in order to annex global-centric perspective? And the only 2 options I can think of is either one, Independence Day level stuff, the discovery of other life, something that really wakes us up to the fact that we are here together on this little blue marble, and that's the sort of, so it's the
Other beings, other gods.
astronauts, the others, or some form of psychonauts, some form of expansion in consciousness that you could scale.
I love how consciousness is such a flexible suitcase for just about any problem we have. Well, we'll solve it in consciousness. Well, we live in consciousness. I mean, what other space are you going to solve it in?
Rapidly, relatively speaking, within the span of a generation, that gives people a post-conventional global perspective in their interiors, such that when we get back to start doing your longer, bigger, harder project, there are people who are actually holding that beat.
There's several routes to the place you're talking about. None of them are easy, but they're relatively straightforward. One thing is the fact that we have become an existential threat to ourselves slots in very nicely to the enemy that we face together, right? We've seen the enemy, it is us.
Oh. It's us, but is it all of us the same?
And so that awareness of that can, I believe, trigger the kind of unity that you're talking about. The problem is that narrative, which I believe is true, we have become the existential threat to ourselves, that narrative is in conflict with those who are most powerful in civilization, who would like to keep it running as it is because it's feeding them pretty darn well.
So what to do with them? So here's the question. Are you willing to die for the sake of your enemies? When you believe your enemies are not just people against you personally, but are people with the wrong ideas who are destroying the world. Because that's pretty much what's at the basis of every genocide. The Soviet Union tried to, prime the pump of history to get us to that workers' paradise by, decimating the farmers in Ukraine. The Nazis tried to speed up the evolution of history by getting rid of the Jews. There's always an enemy. There's always someone standing in the way. And it's wonderful to say, well, I'm going to just I'm going to use the story verse to override my robot programming and not put anyone in a gas chamber. Okay. How exactly are you going to deal with these people who are holding back your vision of what needs to happen in the world when you're pretty darn sure that unless something happens to these people to get them out of power or to marginalize or to exile them or to do something to, we're not going to kill them. Well, listen to your own story. Aren't we in that wealthy period where we're liberal because there's abundance? Yeah. So your program doesn't sound like it's very different from every other program of how to fix the world. And I don't know that you fully appreciate where you are in it. And I don't mean anything against them, but this is a problem we all have. So what is the good? Bret says, well, in order to achieve the good, which is, the species must go on, we need to marginalize those that are in power. That those who hold on to power in a certain way of organizing the world because it works pretty good for them, in other words, a group that has wealth, status, whatever you define it, race, well, that's probably us here in North America because, we're the 1% in many ways in the world. We have to stop. Well, they have to be stopped. Well, how are you going to do that? Marginalize, kill, exile, take them out of power, take away the vote. How are you going to do that? And replaced by whom? Well, the person with the grand idea about how the world needs to run. But they're not motivated? They don't have motivated reasoning? I mean, Bret's a really smart guy, and I think there's a lot of truth in terms of what he says, but where are you going to go with this? It doesn't seem to be going much of anywhere. I mean, those who think the right thoughts and those who have the right ideas, because again, in the story verse, it's the story that governs. Now, what good does Bret seek? Society must be preserved, and we're going to hear this in The Abolition of Man. The me that can be transactional about the genetic makeup of his son is still, in a sense, a code. It's a story code. It might not be made up of 4 letters, but it's a story. And again, we look at Harari's Sapien on the revolution of the genetic verse to the story verse. Why is Weinstein's story verse of more value than the genetic verse? Where's the standard that says that? Well, it's been able to give us all of these wonderful things like science and technology, and the population of human beings and our domesticated animals has completely dominated the planet. Is that a good thing? Well, talk to the people that think that nobody should ever be born because they suffer. Do we have happier lives than our ancestral hunter-gatherers someplace? Harari says probably not, but we don't know because none of us within our tiny little lifetimes, or even within the tiny lifetimes of ancestors that we've been able to know, maybe parents and grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents, and maybe reading history a bit further back, how can we determine if well-being is better for us than it was for those religious hunter-gatherers? Where are you going to find the ruler to make those measurements? Why is Weinstein's story verse of more value than the genetic verse? Me trumps Gattaca. Why? Now let's take a look again at this three-way conversation that we've looked at quite a bit.
So look, I mean, it seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you made an absolute moral claim in the moral landscape, and that's what grounds your argument. The absolute moral
Let's
claim
just take
is,
this evil piece, because it'll be interesting if it's not totally on point.
Okay.
The reason why evil is susceptible to total deflation is, if you agree with me, evil is a category of human misbehavior, human intention, that we don't understand significantly at the level of the brain. But if we did understand it totally at the level of the brain, then every evil person we had in the dock at trial would be just like Charles Whitman with his brain tumor after he shot up everyone at the University of Texas.
Now, wait a minute. Are you saying that all the Nazis, I mean, because earlier you said, the Nazis and the Gulag, that was evil. They all had a brain problem? Is that what you're saying? No, because, and many other places say, no, the problem is that they had other beliefs that were a problem. And then he tries to make the Nazis and the Soviets to be religious people. Okay, and actually I buy that, because we're all religious people, including Sam. He's the one that says they're not. So Sam's definition of religious gets pretty selective. But now you refer to a guy who had a specific biological, physical problem in his brain and saying that's what evil is. And once we learn that, but now what Weinstein just said is that this is programmed, in fact, all the way down to our DNA. In fact, a respiratory enzyme, even if it's less functioning than your respiratory enzyme, still wants you dead. So what world is Sam talking about?
Right, so like he's the prototypically evil mass murderer, but he's complaining about this change that overcame his personality, and he thinks it would be a good idea that if after the cops kill me, you autopsy my brain, because I don't know why I'm doing any of this, right? And lo and behold, he had a glioblastoma pressing on his amygdala, and all of a sudden it made sense of his behavior in a way that a full understanding of psychopathy or every other variant of human evil would make sense of it in a way that would be deflationary ethically.
Okay. And so I wonder if at this point that Sam is saying, let's do brain surgery on evil people, because that's how we can fix them.
Then you look at someone like Saddam Hussein, or the worst evil person you could imagine, and you would say, well, he's actually unlucky. There but for the grace of biology go I.
And then why would evil and good be then lined up with religious and non-religious? I mean, this argument about the brain just makes no sense. And it doesn't, and I wish Weinstein would have jumped in on him. He said, hey, wait a minute. What we do when we kill other people, what the Nazis did to the Jews and the Slavs and those they considered to be racially inferior, what the Soviets did to their enemies, this is built into all of us, which is in fact Peterson's point. It's not only built into all of us, but if you listen to almost any secular plan for saving ourselves from ourselves, by definition, it involves us against them. And it doesn't have to do with some very rare tumor in the brain pressing against the pituitary. Because if you basically did an autopsy on all the Nazi guards, you're probably not going to find brain structures that they have in common. And then Sam would say, oh, but anything that we think or do, that's just our brain expressing itself. But this is where, again, Peterson's walk through Auschwitz is so important, because Peterson says, I'm capable of this. What, because you have a tumor pressing on your pituitary? No. And Harris will go on to, this is just incoherent.
Because if I had that brain, if I had those genes, if I had those influences that gave me those symptoms.
influences.
Synapses, I would be just like him. Now, if you think there's some other element that gives us free will, and now then you and I are disagreeing, then that's a factual claim that's at variance with mine. But if we are,
but then Sam, why are you arguing? I mean, this is the problem.
Just on some level malfunctioning biological systems when we're being evil, then a complete understanding of evil would cancel that category.
Can you define evil so we know what you're talking about?
Well, take just the worst people who have sadistically victimized.
I'm going to define evil, but I'm not going to use the word evil. I'm going to say worst.
The most people, and those are the evilest people we can name.
So wait a second. So when you say, I think this is actually really important, because I think actual evil of that kind is pretty darn rare, and there's a lot of badness that emerges from a kind of
the most troubling thing
rationality.
are all the good people doing evil because they're ruled by bad ideas. But that I think is more consequential.
Peterson's over there.
Introduced a whole set of other things here.
It's like,
about free will and evil, but
Peterson's like, I'm a scientist. I'm trying to reduce the number of variables, and you just vomited a whole bunch of new ones up on the table.
I just want to make it clear why I went there. So you were saying this is I forgot the word you used, inevitable or ineluctable, or it's permanent. The implication is that this category is permanent, and I'm saying that I don't think evil in that sense is a permanent category for us. It awaits more.
See, and this is funny because, again, Harris begins by saying, I believe in objective value. Nazism is always evil. The Gulag is always evil. But now, again, he gives up the game.
Information and insight.
okay. We're going to distinguish for a minute good versus evil and good versus bad. Just for
Okay, and that goes on. But what did he say before? Well, hear what he said before.
I think it's easier, perhaps, to gain initial agreement between people on what might constitute a generalized ethic, to concentrate on what we don't want.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that what we do want is unimportant, but it seems to me to be harder to get a grip on. We don't want Auschwitz. We don't want the Gulag Archipelago. So, and there are...
And I would add, to just closing the door to moral relativism here, those who do want Auschwitz are wrong to want Auschwitz. I mean, it's obviously
Right.
Auschwitz only happened because some people did want Auschwitz, not the victim side, but the perpetrator side. And so, crucially for me is the claim that I'm a realist. I'm a moral realist, and what realism means is that there are right and wrong answers to questions of this kind, and you cannot know what you're missing. In fact, we almost certainly don't know what we're missing on questions of human value, and our job is to discover just how good life can be and just what variables are making it needlessly horrible, and to mitigate all of that and live in a better and better world.
Okay, well, so...
All right, Sam, I really don't know what to do with you, but there it is. Let's get back to C.S. Lewis's Tao. And again, this is what Sam Harris is looking for, because this is universal, because later he's going to talk about Hinduism. Well, in early Hinduism, that conduct in a man which can be called good consists in conformity to, or almost participation in, the Rita, that great ritual or pattern of nature and supernature which is revealed alike in the cosmic order, the moral virtues, the ceremony of the temple. Rightness, correctness, order, the Rita, is constantly identified with satya, or truth, corresponding to reality. So, in a sense, but so let's call that good. Sam should be in alignment with that. As Plato said, that the good is beyond existence. It's transcendent. Iris Murdoch. And Wordsworth, that through virtue the stars were strong. So the Indian masters say that the gods themselves are born of Rita and obey it. This is the Tao, according to Lewis, okay? This is this moral order. The Chinese also speak of a great thing, the greatest thing, called the Tao, which is in reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. Now remember, Lewis is not saying that he's saying this is what the Chinese say it is. In other words, he's making the point that This is something, and those of you who know your Bibles might read Romans 1 here, that there is something that we know about God. That's in a sense what Lewis is saying here. It is nature. It is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes, the way in which things everlastingly emerge stilly and tranquilly into space and time. It is also the way in which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, conforming to all activities to that great exemplar. In ritual, say the Analects, it is harmony with nature that is prized. The ancient Jews likewise praised the law as being true. So go ahead and read Psalm 119. This conception in all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike, I shall henceforth refer for brevity simply as the Tao. Some of the accounts of it, which I have quoted, will seem, perhaps to many of you, merely quaint or even magical. But what is common to them all is something we cannot neglect. It is the doctrine of objective value, that belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false, to the kind of things in the universe, to the kind of thing the universe is, and the kind of things we are. Those who know the Tao can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions at the moment, but to recognize a quality which demands, there's an ought, a certain response from us, whether we make it or not. The waterfall was sublime. I myself do not enjoy the society of small children, says C.S. Lewis, because I speak from within the Tao. I recognize this as a defect in myself, just as a man may have to recognize that he is tone deaf or colorblind. And because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective value, therefore emotional states can be in harmony with reason when we feel liking for what ought to be approved, or out of harmony with reason when we perceiving that liking is due but cannot feel it. It's not an emotion, but hopefully, if trained well, we can, in fact, have proper emotions according to the Tao, so that the Nazi guard who was enjoying the torture of his victims was not in accordance. And C.S. Lewis is saying this has broad multicultural implications, that you can know good and bad across cultures. There's a transcendent good. Now, the celebrity atheists aren't looking to get rid of the Tao. They are trying to reform the world along some line. But they've got a lot of problems figuring out or even admitting to what's the line, what's the standard against which they wish to reform the world. So that brings us to the second chapter of The Abolition of Man, called The Way.
2. The Way. It is upon the trunk that a gentleman works. Analects of Confucius, 1:2. The practical result of education in the spirit of the Green Book must be the destruction of the society which accepts it. But this is not necessarily a refutation of subjectivism about values as a theory. The true doctrine might be a doctrine which, if we accept, we die. No one who speaks from within the Tao could reject it on that account.
Now, they skip, the reading skips the Greek, but again, there are a lot of websites out there. One is Lewisania, and it mentions the Greek here. The Greek quotation is "to kill us in broad daylight," which is from Homer. The idea of accepting death rather than evading manifest truth is related as a more dramatic variant to what Lewis elsewhere commended in a Socratic principle: follow the argument wherever it leads. What he's saying here, let me pull it up again. What he's saying here is that there are things worth more than just life. Well, what kind of sense does that make to our assassin code, where the enzyme coding wants to kill you so that even the better coded enzyme in you will die. It's the selfish gene.
But it has not yet come to that. There are theoretical difficulties in the philosophy of Gaius and Titius. However subjective they may be about some traditional values, Gaius and Titius have shown by the very act of writing the Green Book that there must be some other values about which they are not subjective at all.
And this holds true of the celebrity atheists too. They in a sense are working within the Tao while trying to deny it any association with religion, but they're simply embedded within it.
Not subjective at all. They write in order to produce certain states of mind in the rising generation, if not because they think those states of mind intrinsically just or good, yet certainly because they think them to be the means to some state of society which they regard as desirable.
They are on the circuit, they're making money, they're writing books, and I'm not going to say craven things like they're just doing it for the money. They're sincere. They believe this. They are trying to improve society, and they're trying to do so. And what you see here in Chapter 2 is that the celebrity atheists are no different from Gaius and Titius.
It would not be difficult to collect from various passages in the Green Book what their ideal is, but we need not. The important point is not the precise nature of their end, but the fact that they have an end at all.
In other words, they do have a purpose. Now, they might say that, well, we can't really get a purpose from nature. We can't finish the rectangle, but they're working from a purpose. They have an idea of the good, and they're working towards it, just like Bret Weinstein is in that video I played.
They must have, or their book, being purely practical in intention, is written to no purpose. And this end must have real value in their eyes.
In other words, they do have a purpose, and purposes sneak in because we can't live without them.
To abstain from calling it good and to use instead such predicates as necessary or progressive or efficient would be a subterfuge. They could be forced by argument to answer the questions necessary for what, progressing towards what, effecting what.
And this is a trick that I often play when people want to get into debates about things like marriage. Just bring the purpose question in and say, well, I think marriage is this. And I'd say, well, what is marriage for? And it's usually by that question that you may uncover some purposes that are back in your head that might not be lodged in your consciousness. And it's for this reason that Alex Rosenberg keeps slipping ought into things. Well, Alex, what exactly are you trying to come to? You believe that certain forms of society are better than others. That you are directing across a line that leads to purpose, even if you're denying it or you're not even conscious of your own purposes.
In the last resort, they would have to admit that some state of affairs was in their opinion good for its own sake. And this time they could not maintain that good simply described their own emotion about it. For the whole purpose of their book is so to condition the young reader that he will share their approval, and this would be either a fool's or a villain's undertaking unless they held that their approval was in some way valid or correct. In actual fact, Gaius and Titius will be found to hold, with complete uncritical dogmatism, the whole system of values which happened to be in vogue among moderately educated young men of the professional classes during the period between the two wars.
Now, of course, Lewis is talking about these two individuals and where they grew up, and this is sociology of knowledge. And in that sense, this is Peterson telling the celebrity atheist, well, you're Christian because you absorbed, without even knowing it, through your books, all kinds of Christian assumptions about moral value. You just did. And you don't even know yourself well enough to know that it's in there.
Their skepticism about values is on the surface. It is for use on other people's values. About the values current in their own set, they are not nearly skeptical enough. And this phenomenon is very...
Wait till you get to the point of where I play Dillahunty and Peterson when they're talking about skepticism. Peterson basically does C.S. Lewis on Matt Dillahunty here because he says, you're not skeptical enough about your values, and Dillahunty just denies him.
And this phenomenon is very useful. A great many of those who debunk traditional or, as they would say, sentimental values have in the background values of their own which they believe to be immune from the debunking process.
I can think of a channel that almost all their videos are debunk, 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 debunk. Well, okay, put forward your values and account for them.
Debunking process. They claim to be cutting away the parasitic growth of emotion, religious sanction, and inherited taboos in order that real or basic values may emerge. I will now try to find out what happens if this is seriously attempted.
In other words, he's saying, what if the celebrity atheists actually did what they say they're due instead of smuggling in all these Christian values under the surface?
Let us continue to use the previous example, that of death for a good cause. Not, of course, because virtue is the only value or martyrdom the only virtue, but because this is the experimentum crucis, which shows different systems of thought in the clearest light. Let us suppose that an innovator in values regards dulce et decorum and greater love hath no man as mere irrational sentiments which are to be stripped off in order that we may get down to the realistic or basic ground of this value. Where will he find such a ground? First of all, he might say that the real value lay in the utility of such sacrifice to the community. Good, he might say, means what is useful to the community. But of course the death of the community is not useful to the community, only the death of some of its members. What is really meant is that the death of some men is useful to other men. That is very true. But on what ground are some men being asked to die for the benefit of others? Every appeal to pride, honor, shame, or love is excluded by hypothesis. To use these would be to return to sentiment, and the innovator's task is, having cut all that away, to explain to men, in terms of pure reasoning, why they will be well advised to die that others may live. He may say, unless some of us risk death, all of us are certain to die. But that will be true only in a limited number of cases. And even when it is true, it provokes the very reasonable counter-question, why should I be one of those who take the risk?
Now it's interesting because when I listened to this the other day, I thought of this conversation. Now, Pangburn seems to have its volume low, so sorry about that.
It doesn't matter whether it was an act of free will or if it was my lawnmower.
It's clearly not good for you because you think you're valuable and worth preserving.
Yes.
Okay, that's the issue. Why do you think you're valuable and worth preserving?
Because I am the descendants of people who thought they were valuable and worth preserving.
And we're going to get to this argument a little bit later in the book, not in this video.
The ones who didn't think that have killed themselves. But this is not a
So it's instinct. Really?
statement about... This is not a statement about intrinsic value.
I don't know. Yes, I think
No,
it is.
it's-
Okay, but I think it is.
Okay. The reason that we talk about this in terms of well-being is because irrespective of whether or not I care about well-being, there are facts about well-being.
Sure, let's hear them, man. Line those suckers up.
If you chop off my head, it's in contradiction to my well-being. I mean, but the point
No, I wasn't willing to grant that, actually.
Okay.
I'm saying that's a metaphysical presupposition.
Metaphysical presupposition. This you don't find that in atoms. You find that in the Storyverse.
You're just saying I have to accept that.
No,
Like,
I'm not telling you
because
at all what to accept.
Sure you are. You're saying that your death would be
I'm
wrong.
trying to explain what my position is.
Okay, but you said that wouldn't be in accordance with your well-being. Okay, that's a metaphysical statement or philosophical statement. It's not an obvious fact.
That
That's not
chopping
a
off somebody's
fact.
head is contrary to their well-being.
Depends on how you define well-being.
See, and right here with Dillahunty and Harris is they get squishy on one hand about the definition of fact. Whenever they try to make their metaphysical claims, facts get to be this elastic suitcase that almost anything can go into. But when they're trying to debunk someone else, well, fact is this thing I can touch, taste, or hear.
Sure.
Yeah, but it matters.
But if you define well-being as this glass of water, we're no longer talking about the same thing.
Well, you can define well-being. That's fine. That's what I'm waiting for.
This is what I'm... Well,
You can't do it. You can't define well-being. It's
Well,
very,
then why
very
should I try? I
difficult.
certainly can't do it if you keep telling me I can't do it.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll back off. There's a. Go ahead. I'm all ears.
So,
See, this is why Peterson's so much fun to watch.
the primary objection to mine and Sam's position that keeps coming back is, why should anybody care about well-being? And we both will acknowledge that this is, in fact, a subjective preference. There are people who are going to care about well-being, there are people who aren't. The second objection is that well-being is not.
I don't know if they're really going to care about well-being differently. I think they're going to define well-being differently.
Clearly defined. Both of us have acknowledged this. It's not as if we're saying we have all the answers to how to go about living a better life. We're just saying.
And this, again, this eschatology among the celebrity atheists is really interesting. But, well, we don't have all the answers and we don't know. Okay, what is guiding your decisions today? Because you already have an existent hierarchy that you're living at when you're not on stage. Where did you get that one from? And that's exactly where Peterson keeps saying, you've borrowed the Christian one. You go on stage and debunk it, but when you live your life, we all kind of live the same because it all snuck in through our culture.
That however we're going to define well-being, which is, I say you can start with a couple of foundations. You could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way. And
Stop suffering.
Death is preferable to life? Well, what about this guy? Antinatalism. Well, very simple syllogism. To live a human life is to suffer. If your goal is reducing suffering, don't birth people. Then you won't have suffering. Well, animal suffering you're not going to worry about, but a dead universe has no suffering. And it's, in a sense, in this way that the goals get revealed.
No, I'm saying you could start with death is preferable to life, but you don't get very far that way because those
you do. You stop suffering. You just die.
Yes.
Right, so you can start with the presupposition.
Except that when you're dead, you're not being, so there's no well-being.
But there's an assumption underneath there. And the question is, what's at the top of your hierarchy? Is it suffering or is it being? Why is one above the other in your hierarchy?
No, well, that's not necessarily the
if
case.
We're looking for the
And here he addresses the crowd. This is very interesting, rewatching these videos again and again.
things about our life, you can't say death is better.
Yeah, you can.
Well,
in a sense, what Dillahunty is saying here is that, well, to live and to suffer is better than to die. Okay, well, what about killing infants that are, or unborn children that have terrible birth defects? What about euthanasia? I mean, again, you're making decisions, even political statements in the present world, based on a metaphysic that on stage you're kind of flipping on its head.
I know that you can say
People do all the time. They do. No, look.
They can
I'm
express
not
their
being
preference,
flippant
but
about
their
this.
preference can be wrong. How can it possibly be?
Their preference can be wrong. Well, again, here's your standard. Where is your standard?
For your life if you're dead.
What if you, are a terminal burn victim with cancer?
This is the point that I was getting to. I am perfectly fine with the idea that for certain instances.
But here's the funny thing about certain instances. Now, this is where, again, we get into Bret Weinstein's comment about the fat years and the lean years because, well, in wealthy, affluent Western society where we simply assume, mostly promoted by the propaganda of our media, that everyone is happy and healthy and everything's going great for everyone, and little old you has the problem. Again, look up Scott Alexander's How Bad Things Really Are. Oh, just a few people get cancer? Well, let me tell you something about people. All of us suffer, and all of us will die. Now you might say, well, we should speed our death before we suffer. Well, you just flipped on its head the idea that, that being is better than cutting your head off. I mean, what happened to that value? Well, only just a few people suffer. Really? I don't see that. I don't see that at all. In fact, I can go down the street, and if I talk to people long enough, you have the initial polite facade, which is a very useful thing, but I'm a pastor, I start digging into their people, and what do I find? Everybody suffers. So then you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. Is life worth the suffering? David Benatar, his antinatalism, says no. Don't have children because they will suffer. That's the moral thing to do. Okay, if that's your moral system, what's at the top of your moral hierarchy? Anti-suffering. It's problematic because, again, we will exchange meaning. We will exchange suffering for meaning. We will take meaning and say, I will suffer. You can Nietzsche, Viktor Frankl, you can endure almost anyhow if you have a why. Dillahunty's scheme has no room for this observation.
There may be occasions that death is preferable to an individual over life. But when we're speaking
an individual, and I mean, if you read Maps of Meaning, Peterson trots out the whole trolley thing with all kinds of other addendums to it, which is really interesting. Who can do this math?
In broader terms, if we're talking about let's create the best society we can, let's create the best quality of life we can for people, death is not that across the board. That doesn't mean that there aren't individual exceptions. So the foundations...
How is death an exception? It comes to all of us. Suffering comes to all of us. How do you decide when death is preferable to life? When non-existence, at least in your metaphysical term, because those are assertions, the crazy thing about, read Kierkegaard's Despair Unto Death, where you get to the point of someone's like, I'm suffering, I'm despairing, I want to die. And what if they discover that suicide is not the antidote to despair? That suicide, that the person who kills themselves realizes they haven't extinguished their story, and their story continues, and the despair still has them. What then?
That I started with. You could start with death is better than life, but blah, blah, blah. If you start with life is generally preferable to death, health is generally preferable to sickness, happiness is generally preferable to sadness, none of these are absolute locked in stone rules. From those things...
Okay, so if you start with them.
Yes, if you start...
So you're not skeptical about those claims?
Wow.
Well,
This is Lewis is saying, you're not nearly as skeptical about the claims you ought to be than you are. And now Dillahunty's going to basically use a social pushback to try and get out of Peterson's point.
No, I came out and said that I wasn't going to be trying to straw man you left and right. And now every time I say something, you're like, oh, so you're not skeptical about it.
Well, I thought we're just dealing with reason and arguments, and now hierarchies of interest and personality and sociology have intruded upon our pure room of reason here.
Well, I'm trying to No, sorry, I'm not trying to attack you. I'm trying to understand where your argument begins.
Well, it seems odd that you would come out with, so you're not skeptical about that.
Well, that's a
question. While I'm on my skepticism tour, while I'm in mid-sentence to describe that these are the general foundations that you start with.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Build a building with a general foundation. The engineer goes there and says, yeah, I'm going to build a general foundation for this building. It's not going to be specific. How specific? How not specific?
Okay, so but what you're saying, if you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not trying to be difficult. You're saying that those are your starting positions. Those are the things that you accept.
I'm saying they can be.
Faith.
No.
Oh, you have a rationale for them.
Yes.
Let's hear it.
You already have. Life is generally preferable to death because we're talking about our life.
Depends on what life is for. David Benatar comes and says, we suffer. So therefore, don't have children. So what's your rationale against David Benatar? Do you have one? Or are these, in fact, axiomatic presuppositions that you have brought to the table? And that's basically what Dillahunty now just concedes.
And death is generally not in the interest of the living.
Ah, whose death? We just finished reading that, because every time we have a war, we say, your death is in the interest of the rest of the living. You have to die for the sake of everyone else. Well, why? How is that in my best interest? It all depends on who is we? How do we define this?
It can be an exception. This is the point that I was getting.
Exception? What is exactly an exception? When it comes to me, am I an exception? I'm my whole life, right? Especially under your terms of what a human being is.
So you could start with those founded. You could start with any three that you found.
Ooh. How about there is a God? Can you start with that? No, that's the one you say you can't start with.
You could pick three arbitrary foundations. And the one aspect that makes a secular moral system distinct from religious pronouncements and divine command theory and those sorts of things is that the secular moral system has as its goal the object of getting better at getting better, which means if you find out that one of your foundations is wrong or in conflict with something else, you can now change that.
What's the criteria when you find that it's wrong? What's the criteria for wrong? On one hand, you're building a building and you're saying the foundations are arbitrary, but if you find out that it's wrong, it's an evidentialist, foundationalist system you're trying to construct, and you just completely undermine it. And what you're saying is that mid-course, I can decide I like something better. Well, why can't I like God? Why can't I like Jesus? Why can't I like Dumbo's feather? You said it's arbitrary. And now it's whatever works for you. So what exactly is your goal? And I'd have to say that it seems to be with well-being that your goal is, just as Peterson said at the first video I played in this video, the reduction of suffering. There's your purpose. Peterson has just said, death, killing yourself, can pursue that purpose. This is how meaning works. This is how people work. You have meaning according to your purpose. It's even how morality works. If your goal is suffering, is to end suffering, then suddenly it's moral, as you say with euthanasia, to kill in order to preserve life. Or, Bret Weinstein, it's important to alienate those people for whom our dangerous system is working in order so that some new utopia can come about. But this is exactly the system of every tyrant. So what you need is actually something outside the system, someone who is a judge who can't be corrupted. Well, why? Well, because by definition, that's what you need, someone above every human being. Well, the law. Well, okay, so we've got the Tao. Well, that's a good thing, but how are we going to find that?
At this point, the innovator may ask why, after all, selfishness should be more rational or intelligent than altruism. The question is welcome. If by reason we mean the process actually employed by Gaius and Titius when engaged in debunking, that is, the connecting by inference of propositions ultimately derived from sense data with further propositions, then the answer must be that a refusal to sacrifice oneself is no more rational than a consent to do so, and no less rational. Neither choice is rational or irrational at all. From propositions about fact alone, no practical conclusion can ever be drawn. This will preserve society cannot lead to do this except by the mediation of society ought to be preserved. This will cost you your life cannot lead directly to do not do this. It can lead to it only through a felt desire or an acknowledged duty of self-preservation. The innovator is trying to get a conclusion in the imperative mood out of premises in the indicative mood. And though he continues trying to all eternity, he cannot succeed, for the thing.
And this is where you'll get Peterson's, you can't get an ought from an is. And Lewis just uses grammar terms.
For the thing is impossible. We must therefore either extend the word reason to include what our ancestors called practical reason, and confess that judgments such as society ought to be preserved, though they can support themselves by no reason of the sort that Gaius and Titius demand, are not mere sentiments, but are rationality itself.
In other words, society ought to preserve. Well, this is a feeling that I have. And so in a sense with Dillahunty and Harris to say, well, it's self-evident. That's this feeling that society ought to be preserved. And Lewis wants to say, great, good. But as Peterson says, where are you getting that idea? Reason? Not getting it from reason. You're bringing it to the table. And when we have these feelings, it's not the case that, well, I just feel society ought to be preserved in the same way that I feel eating ice cream sandwiches is enjoyable. No, those are two different feelings. Well, maybe my body loves ice cream sandwiches because they're full of sugar and fat. Okay, well, there's a correspondence. And society ought to be preserve that feeling within me actually corresponds to something out there in the world. And there's something inside of me, a conscience, which is not simply from above, but also from below, that is built into me, that needs to be fostered and trained and nurtured, that when I see Matt Dillahunty throwing Sam Harris off the stage, I say, yeah, we've talked about this, but your value as human beings dictates that is wrong.
Itself, or else we must give up at once and forever the attempt to find a core of rational value behind all the sentiments we have debunked. The innovator will not take the first alternative, for practical principles known to all men by reason are simply the Tao which he has set out to supersede. He is more likely to give up the quest for a rational core and to hunt for some other ground even more basic and realistic. This he will probably feel that he has found in instinct. The preservation of society and of the species itself are ends that do not hang on the precarious thread of reason. They are given by instinct. That is why there is no need to argue against the man who does not acknowledge them. We have an instinctive urge to preserve our own species. That is why men ought to work for posterity. We have no instinctive urge to keep promises or to respect individual life. That is why scruples of justice and humanity, in fact the Tao, can be properly swept away when they conflict with our real end, the preservation of the species. That, again, is why the modern situation permits and demands a new sexual morality. The old taboos served some real purpose in helping to preserve the species, but contraceptives have modified this, and we can now abandon many of the taboos. For, of course, sexual desire, being instinctive, is to be gratified whenever it does not conflict with the preservation of the species. It looks, in fact, as if an ethics based on instinct will give the innovator all he wants and nothing that he does not want. In reality, we have not advanced one step. I will not insist on the point that instinct is a name for we know not what. To say that migratory birds find their way by instinct is only to say that we do not know how migratory birds find their way. For I think it is here being used in a fairly definite sense, to mean an unreflective or spontaneous impulse widely felt by the members of a given species. In what way does instinct, thus conceived, help us to find real values? Is it maintained that we must obey instinct, that we cannot do otherwise? But if so, why are green books and the like written? Why this stream of exhortation to drive us where we cannot help going? Why such praise for those who have submitted to the inevitable? Or is it maintained that if we do obey instinct, we shall be happy and satisfied? But the very question we are considering was that of facing death, which, so far as the innovator knows, cuts off every possible satisfaction. And if we have an instinctive desire for the good of posterity, then this desire, by the very nature of the case, can never be satisfied, since its aim is achieved, if at all, when we are dead. It looks very much as if the innovator would have to say not that we must obey instinct, nor that it will satisfy us to do so, but that we ought to obey it. But why ought we to obey instinct?
And I'll leave that for the next video. So we have our secular or atheist moral menu. Rosenberg, nihilism, no purpose or objective moral reality. It's just what we want, so therefore can. So have at it, boys and girls. There is no ought. Murdoch, transcendent good, but she's at least fesses up to the difficulties of her position. We've got to have one. But how? I don't know. Rorty gets a little bit more specific. Crowdsourcing pragmatism, but uneasy with the implication in a tyrannical world. What if multiple generations, in fact, you say, well, we'll never again suffer multiple generations under tyranny. Most of human history has lived most of its life under tyranny. And, to say that we prefer what we have now, well, I'm with Peterson on that, but showing the ruler why it's better, well, you say, well, we won the 20th century. Well, yeah, the United States helped win the 20th century, but there were, France didn't do too well in the Second World War. Why? Was it because of their moral system, or was it more complex than that? Celebrity atheists use rhetorical tools for popular consumption, but again, the celebrity atheists are not, I guess it depends on what Jordan Peterson's goals are, but I don't find them, if Jordan Peterson is going to the celebrity atheists in order to try through conversation to make progress in trying to sort these things out, he is going to the wrong tribe. Now maybe, and this perhaps helps us locate Peterson, maybe in a sense Peterson is on some levels kind of like them, because he's out there in the in the popular world, unlike many academics who, like Alister McGrath, quite a bit more dry. Well, maybe church people like this because church people have built up a capacity to listen to dryness because they go to church all the time. And maybe when you say, I find church boring, the problem isn't with the service, the problem is with you. And maybe what you should say is that when you recognize that, you should say, I can't read that book because it's hard. Well, maybe the goal should be to become more educated and better at reading books than necessary to say books should be more entertaining. And you've got theistic systems. C.S. Lewis says, all cultures have assumed the Tao, and we never get beyond it. And that's why these reform efforts, well, pay attention to them, because there's something going on, and you've got to see what's really going on. And now note, Christianity, and this is where some people say, well, the Tao, that you've just ruined some of Christianity's exclusive claims. Christianity assumes with many other religions the Tao, and actually in the appendix of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, there are a bunch of pages where he says, yeah, there's commonality between some of the moral law in Christianity and the moral law you can find in other cultures. Lewis doesn't deny that. But is Christianity, and this is what many people assume, simply about telling people this is what you should do and having carrots and sticks to enforce it? And I would say that's not at all what Christianity is about. But Christianity certainly does understand carrots and sticks and sowing and reaping. That's my dog snoring. My little dog has a very big snore. Peterson wants Darwinian survival for purpose, and there are real issues with this, and I pointed this out in the previous videos, that Finchness, in the Metaphysical Club, is in a sense what's at stake with Darwinianism. And so Peterson, I think, has some fogginess between, okay, so you've got Darwinian truth and you've got Darwinian purpose, but you've also got suffering. And I don't think, I guess, the deeper I get into Peterson, probably now after a year of thinking about him, and I don't have any embarrassment about this. We're all growing and learning, and I'm not the smartest person in the world. Thankfully so, because smart people have other things they have to deal with. But so Darwinian purpose, how does that really match up with suffering? And even with Dillahunty, some of those issues are coming out with Peterson. And so, Peterson continues to work through these issues, and that's probably something that I'd want to probe with him. And he finds the Tao in a priori structures. And I think this is actually, now again, my theological tradition, if you say God reveals himself only from above, no. God reveals himself only from below, no. Heidelberg Catechism, God reveals himself in 2 books, general and special revelation, from below and from above. Okay? And at some point, I'd like to continue to think about how that below and above continue to mesh together. But what's interesting is essentially Jordan Peterson is saying the Tao is built into us from below. And I think when you look at, say, Bret Weinstein and those issues, we begin to see the below-above issues coming forward in that. Because, in a sense, Bret Weinstein says we have our genetic code from below, but we have this story verse from above. And, well, where did we get our story from? What if, Dorothy Sayers, what if God inserted himself in the story to help our story verse? Well, if God would insert himself in the story, he'd probably do it in such a way that his story would, by all measures, be the story that is propagated in the world beyond all others. That's the definition of the Bible. So where's the evidence? Is it evidence? Is it a leap of faith? So I think, again, Peterson, for me, my consciousness committee, after listening to Peterson, I mean, I got interested in him, and because I'm thinking he's helping me with stuff from below. This is really helpful stuff. But via my religious tradition, I also know stuff from above, and so I kind of want to get these things lined up. Next, in the abolition of man, more on instinct. And yeah, this has gone on. Oh, it's not as bad as I thought. We're going to be over 2 hours, but this is pretty good. So I'm trying to be a better YouTuber. So if you liked my video, you surely wouldn't still be watching. Subscribe. Just hit that little subscribe button. And if you like doing this, either support me via Patreon, which is one thing, or you can always make donations to my congregation, which is supports the ministry of my church. So thanks for watching.